Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your country has lost a devastating war. Millions of people are unemployed, your economy is collapsing, and foreign powers are telling you exactly how large your military can be and what you are allowed to do. In the middle of this chaos, someone walks onto the political stage and says he knows exactly who to blame. He points to politicians, he points to minorities, he promises jobs, military strength, and that your country will never be humiliated again. That man was Adolf Hitler. We tend to look at World War II and focus purely on the conflict itself, but Germany did not wake up one morning in 1939 and randomly decide to invade Poland. Dictators and global conflicts do not spontaneously appear in a vacuum. They are the result of a predictable chain of events. To trace that chain, we have to look at the end of the First World War. The fighting had devastated Europe, left millions dead, and completely exhausted Germany. That Germany didn't experience a dramatic military invasion of its homeland. The government simply agreed to an armistice. For many German citizens, the fighting abruptly stopped, leaving them shocked and disconnected from the physical reality of the defeat. Then came the Treaty of Versailles. The peace settlement required Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, pay heavy financial reparations, lose significant territory, and severely restrict its military. At the same time, the old German monarchy collapsed. The Kaiser was gone, replaced by a new democratic system known as the Weimar Republic. On paper, democracy sounds like a fresh start. In reality, the new government inherited a broken economy and massive public anger over a lost war. A nascent democracy struggles to survive when its citizens associated directly with national humiliation and economic pain. This 1923 banknote illustrates when that pain peaked. Germany experienced severe hyperinflation, its currency becoming practically worthless. Money for morning bread wasn't enough by the afternoon. Life savings disappeared in hours, replaced by absurd banknotes requiring 5 billion marks for basic goods. Then the chaos paused. Thanks to foreign loans and international cooperation, the German economy stabilized in the mid-1920s. Life became relatively normal, and extremist political movements struggled to gain traction. That brief stability shattered in 1929. The Wall Street crash in the United States triggered a massive global economic crisis. Banks failed, and international trade dried up. Germany was hit especially hard. The foreign loans that had propped up their recovery vanished. Unemployment exploded, throwing people who had just started rebuilding their lives right back into extreme poverty. This severe economic whiplash, from hyperinflation to brief recovery to sudden destitution, snapped the public's remaining trust in the Weimar Republic. People were desperate for anyone who could offer a way out. The Nazi Party weaponized this exact desperation. They designed their message to appeal to specific, frightened demographics. To the working class, they promised employment, bread, and a national revival. Simultaneously, Hitler promised conservative voters he would destroy communism. He presented himself as a strong leader who could end political chaos, masking his extreme racial ideologies behind a shield of aggressive anti-communist stability. Despite this tailored messaging, Hitler did not win an outright majority of the popular vote. He did not simply march into power overnight, and he did not seize control in a violent coup. Instead, in January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg and his circle of conservative politicians appointed Hitler as chancellor. They believed they could control him and use his growing popularity for their own ends. They were catastrophically wrong. Democratic collapse often follows a specific pattern. These institutional elites, in a desperate attempt to secure their own influence, simply invite the extremists into the government themselves. Once inside the government, Hitler moved quickly. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the perfect crisis. The government used the resulting public panic to manufacture a state of fear and immediately suspend civil liberties. Shortly after, they passed the Enabling Act. This law allowed Hitler to bypass normal parliamentary approval entirely. Within months, trade unions were crushed, opposing political parties were eliminated, and political rivals were arrested. The threat level had escalated completely. With control of the chancellery and the suspension of the constitution, Hitler began wielding the full, unchecked machinery of the German state. With state power secured, the Nazis began turning their ideology into policy. In direct defiance of the Versailles Treaty, they introduced conscription, expanded the Air Force, and rapidly rebuilt their military. This map of 1930s Central Europe shows how this military buildup served a specific ideological goal. Hitler wanted to conquer what the Nazis called Lebensraum, living space. That required direct, aggressive military expansion into Eastern Europe. The collapse of Germany's fragile democracy replaced a struggling republic with an expansionist dictatorship. This new regime now possessed both the ideological drive and the state power to challenge the existing borders of Europe. But if Hitler was openly rebuilding his military and demanding territory, why didn't the major European powers step in to stop him? Today, appeasement usually means one thing: foolishly caving in to a bully. In history books, that policy has a face: British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. That reputation was cemented at the 1938 Munich Conference. Chamberlain agreed to let Adolf Hitler annex a massive portion of Czechoslovakia. He returned to London waving a piece of paper, declaring peace for our time. Soon after, Europe was engulfed in the deadliest war in human history. We're taught to view this as a cowardly surrender that directly caused World War II. But if we look at the raw data and military realities of the late 1930s, a different picture emerges. Was appeasing Hitler actually a naive blunder, or a desperate, calculated necessity for a nation that knew it couldn't fight? To understand the choices British leaders made, we have to drop our hindsight and look at the reality of the 1930s. The global economy was shattered by the Great Depression. With mass unemployment and depleted treasuries, nations were intensely focused on their own domestic survival. At the same time, the post-World War I security apparatus was collapsing. The League of Nations, designed to stop aggressive nations through collective security, was quickly exposed as an ineffective bureaucracy, unable to enforce its own rules. Layered on top of this economic ruin was severe psychological trauma. British and French populations were terrified of returning to the meat grinder of trench warfare that wiped out an entire generation just 2 decades earlier. Given the state of their forces and the vulnerability of their far-flung empires, British and French leaders viewed avoiding war as a calculated domestic necessity. This pragmatism drove Britain's early responses to Adolf Hitler. By 1935, Germany was openly flouting the disarmament rules of the Versailles Treaty. Rather than risk a military confrontation they couldn't afford, the British opted for direct compromise. This chart shows the terms of the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Britain accepted Germany's right to rebuild its fleet, but strictly capped the total German naval payload at exactly 35% of the capacity of the British Royal Navy. The logic here is highly specific to the 1930s. British officials believed that negotiating voluntary legal limits on German ships was much safer than ignoring a secret, unrestrained arms race like the one that had triggered the First World War. But this treaty contained a fatal strategic flaw. By acting completely alone, Britain alienated its own allies. France and Italy felt betrayed by the bilateral deal, fracturing the joint diplomatic front they had built to contain Germany. Hitler continued testing the boundaries of the post-World War I order. In early 1938, German troops marched into Austria, executing a bloodless annexation known as the Anschluss. His attention immediately shifted east. Look at this map of Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the dark shaded border regions separating Germany from the Czech interior. This area was rich in mineral resources and held heavily fortified mountain defenses. Because France was bound by a military treaty to defend the Czechs, the world suddenly stood on the absolute brink of war. Hoping to de-escalate the crisis, Chamberlain flew to Munich and negotiated the transfer of these border territories to German control, entirely without Czech consent. It was a horrific diplomatic betrayal of the Czech people. But Chamberlain signed the agreement because he faced a harsh reality. In the fall of 1938, Britain simply lacked the arms, the aircraft, and the readiness to actually win a war. 6 months later, the illusion of peace shattered. In March 1939, Hitler violated the Munich terms and sent troops to liquidate the remainder of the Czech state. The policy of appeasement was officially dead. In response, the British government immediately reversed course. They abandoned compromise and drew a hard military line, offering a formal guarantee to defend Poland, seen here on the map as the next obvious geographic flashpoint, against any German attack. Hitler didn't take the threat seriously. Watching Allied leaders repeatedly back down, he dismissed them as weak little worms, fully expecting them to yield again. To ensure they couldn't intervene, Hitler executed a cynical diplomatic masterstroke, a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This secured Germany's eastern flank and guaranteed a safe supply line of raw materials, effectively neutralizing any future British naval blockade. With the Soviet border secured, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. Drawing a firm diplomatic red line had ultimately failed to deter him. So, did appeasement cause World War II? Blaming the policy for the conflict is entirely backwards. Appeasement was a desperate, ultimately failed mechanism trying to prevent it. Hitler was driven by unbridled expansionism and an ideological step-by-step plan for dominance. The historical evidence shows he fully intended to push for conquest until he provoked a war, meaning the conflict was likely unpreventable from the start. But the failure of appeasement did secure two critical advantages for Great Britain. First, the Munich Agreement bought the country an extra 12 months to frantically delay the inevitable and rearm. That window allowed the RAF to begin moving past planes like this, silver biplanes that were increasingly obsolete, and into the mass production of the monoplane fighters required for modern air defense. They also completed a vast early warning radar network along the coast. This infrastructure, built entirely during that borrowed time, would prove decisive in the Battle of Britain. Beyond military hardware, the delay served a psychological purpose. In 1938, there was a massive public mood for peace in Britain. But by exhausting every avenue for diplomacy, the government proved Hitler's true nature to its citizens. When the war finally broke out in 1939, it was wholly supported by a British public that had come to realize their enemy was either bad or mad. Sometimes a failed peace strategy is exactly what a democracy needs to survive an unavoidable war. Most history books circle September 1st, 1939, as the day the world caught fire. But massive global conflicts don't just appear out of nowhere on a Tuesday. When German tanks rolled into Poland, they simply collapsed a dam that had been cracking for years under the weight of unpunished expansion. To understand why those cracks were ignored, you have to look at the psychological hangover of the 1920s and 30s. The First World War had left millions dead and entire nations deeply traumatized. The overwhelming priority for leaders across Europe was avoiding another conflict, at virtually any cost. But that intense desperation for peace had an unintended side effect. It created a global power vacuum. When a nation is entirely paralyzed by the fear of war, it signals to aggressive regimes that they can push boundaries without facing real consequences. Look at Germany in the early 1930s. The country was buried under the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles and completely crushed by the Great Depression. This was a society defined by massive unemployment and a collapsing currency. The average person standing in those lines wasn't waking up plotting global conquest. They were terrified about losing their jobs, their savings, and their ability to feed their families. Adolf Hitler understood that fear. He didn't invent the economic misery of the Weimar Republic, but he figured out how to weaponize it. He took very real, complicated economic problems and offered the public simple, visible scapegoats, alongside a radical, militant ideology. When people lose complete faith in their institutions to solve basic problems, they look for anyone offering certainty. Economic desperation and political instability provide the exact raw materials a dictatorship needs to dismantle a democracy from the inside. While Germany was radicalizing, the rest of the world was also fracturing. The erosion of global stability was happening across 3 different continents at the exact same time. In East Asia, Japan's military leadership was aggressively expanding its territory to secure natural resources and establish regional dominance, eventually invading mainland China. At the same time, Benito Mussolini was pursuing a parallel vision of an Italian empire, making a violent push into Africa with the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. In theory, the League of Nations existed to prevent exactly this kind of territorial theft, but in practice, international bodies proved completely ineffective. They were highly skilled at passing resolutions, but utterly lacked the mechanism, or the political will, to provide collective military security. A clear message was being broadcast to dictators everywhere: International treaties are essentially meaningless if the countries that sign them refuse to enforce them with actual military power. This diagram shows the mechanism of appeasement, something we can call the escalation staircase. Hitler didn't attempt to conquer Europe in one sudden move. He tested the limits of international tolerance, step by calculated step. When he remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, the Allies did nothing. When he annexed Austria in 1938, the response was more silence. The Axis powers gained momentum and resources, while the line for Allied resistance stayed completely flat. The democratic firewall collapsed entirely during the crises over the Sudetenland and the rest of Czechoslovakia. Each time a gamble went unpunished, the barrier to war dropped further, and the next expansion became physically and psychologically easier to execute. Western leaders, most notably Britain's Neville Chamberlain, genuinely believed they were securing peace by offering concessions. Instead, they were simply giving a hostile regime the time it needed to rearm and expand. The breaking point finally arrived in September 1939. Hitler invaded Poland, pushing past the absolute limits of appeasement and leaving Britain and France no choice but to declare war. By the time that declaration came, peaceful diplomacy was no longer an option. The world had compromised and negotiated until the dictatorship was simply too massive and too heavily armed to be stopped by anything other than total war. But Hitler's own ideology and overconfidence eventually clouded his strategic judgment. Just days after Japan attacked the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, he made the disastrous decision to declare war on the United States. He had severely underestimated his enemies. Once the United States fully mobilized, American factories began producing ships, aircraft, and ammunition on a scale that Axis manufacturing simply couldn't compete with. Germany now found itself trapped in exactly the scenario it had originally tried to avoid: a brutal, multi-front war against a massive coalition that included Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. What began as unchecked territorial land grabs in separate corners of the globe had merged. The Atlantic and Pacific theaters locked together into a single, uncontrollable global inferno. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the cost of stopping the Axis powers was nearly incomprehensible. Entire cities across Europe and Asia were reduced to ash, and tens of millions of people were dead. Beneath the military casualties lay the horrific peak of Nazi ideology. The regime had systematically murdered 6 million Jews, alongside millions of other innocent victims in the Holocaust. The traditional European empires were severely weakened, financially and militarily drained by years of fighting. In their place, a fractured bipolar globe emerged, dominated by two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. If we want to understand why this specific conflict happened, we have to look past the military tactics. It happened because radical dictatorships sought aggressive expansion, and for years, economic crisis, political instability, and a refusal to enforce international boundaries allowed them to grow unchecked. True peace depends on the courage to confront minor aggression early, long before the cost of intervention becomes a global catastrophe. Every ignored warning sign on the path to 1939 serves as a reminder that the window for diplomacy eventually closes forever.